6 a.m. Ouagadougou still slept, but something ancient had already begun to awaken. Not a war, not a riot. This was a seismic shift, silent but unstoppable. 17 armored vehicles carved through the capital's empty streets like blades through silk. No sirens, no spotlights. Only the deafening silence of an operation so precise it felt like fate itself had been rehearsed. In a luxury hotel suite, a French CEO was ripped from silk sheets by gloved hands. In a diplomatic villa, a Canadian executive was pinned face first to imported marble. At a remote private compound, the head of West Africa's largest mining firm was dragged out of a fortified panic room, breached in 43 seconds. None of them believed it, because for decades they had lived untouched, untouchable. Above the law, above the soil, they bled dry. They bought time, bought silence, bought governments. But on this morning, everything changed. And in the center of it all, within a dimly lit command room, stood a man in a plain, dark shirt, sleeves rolled, eyes burning through satellite feeds. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, not behind a podium, not in gold-braided uniform, just a soldier who had seen enough. He did not shout, he did not need to, because this time, Africa would not raise its voice. It would raise its hands. If you believe Africa is no longer for sale, like, comment, and subscribe right now. This is not just a story. This is a revolution wrapped in memory. The control room was bathed in red light. Digital maps, target dossiers, satellite feeds, tracking sleeping silhouettes in foreign-owned estates. At 5:58 a.m., the signal was given. In a synchronized breath, Burkina Faso's special operations teams moved, power grids were cut, generators disabled, cell towers temporarily jammed. Then, at exactly 6:00 a.m., doors shattered. What the world called arrests, Traore called reclamation. There was no shouting, no chaos. Every move was choreographed. Every second accounted for. These were not common criminals. They were architects of a theft that spanned 5 decades. They had bankrupted villages while earning bonuses. They had turned gold into ghosts. But this morning, they were just men in pajamas, breathless and broken, and for once, the law belonged to the soil, not the stock market. 6 months earlier, everything looked normal. Mining conferences, signed MOUs, smiling ambassadors, shaking hands over polished contracts. But Traoré's inner circle saw the patterns. Export records did not match satellite scans. Royalty payments disappeared. Soil readings were doctored, so they formed a task force, a quiet, invisible force. No uniforms, no guns, just flash drives, burner phones, and brilliance. They infiltrated, observed, recorded. They posed as interns, drivers, clerks. Every handshake captured, every lie filed. The goal was not revenge, it was proof, because you cannot reclaim what was stolen if you cannot name what was lost. And by month 5, they had uncovered a rot older than most of the agents involved, so they named it Operation Sovereign Dust, because dust is what Africa was left with. But dust, when stirred, becomes a storm. The investigation was relentless. No raids, no leaks, just patience. For 6 months, data analysts combed through shipping records. Former miners testified in secret. Whistleblowers came forward under cover of night. They found falsified royalty slips, ghost subsidiaries, and cargo that vanished mid-transport. The most damning evidence was elegant. Small discrepancies, grams of gold, minutes of silence that built an empire of theft. Entire villages showed zero government reinvestment, despite billions extracted nearby. They discovered offshore accounts named after trees, contracts signed in countries the mines never operated in. And behind each paper trail, a familiar signature. One name, one company, one network. The deeper they went, the clearer it became. This was not exploitation, it was strategy. And it had gone unchallenged until now. When the task force finalized their investigation, they produced a list, not 5 names, not 10, 32 CEOs, legal officers, logistics managers, all foreign nationals, all complicit. Some had diplomatic immunity. Others had private escape plans or dual citizenships. One even sat on a UN advisory board, but Traore made no distinction. He did not care if they wore suits or uniforms. They were thieves. Each name was paired with evidence, forged contracts, offshore links, fake environmental impact reports. The list was placed in a red file, sealed in the war room. It carried no title, just 3 words: sovereign dust, executions. The time for debate had passed. Now came consequence. If you believe no one, not even the rich, should stand above justice, comment your thoughts below. No operation is perfect, but this one was close. From rooftop snipers to ground teams, each unit was briefed to the second. At 5 a.m., they cut electricity. At 5:50, they jammed cellular signals. At 6:00 sharp, they struck. One CEO tried to escape via a rooftop exit, caught by a silent sniper team. Another locked himself inside a panic room, reinforced with titanium. It was breached in 43 seconds, using a plasma saw. No civilian casualties, no gunfire, just swift, surgical force. Each target was captured alive, each asset confiscated. They called it unconstitutional. Traore called it restoration. By 6:30 a.m., phones rang across Paris, Geneva, Toronto. Mining conglomerates scrambled for updates. PR teams issued vague statements. Company shares fell by 17% in under 4 hours. Western media hesitated. Some labeled Traore a tyrant. Others went silent. But the images spoke for themselves. Foreign executives in cuffs, escorted by African soldiers. A reversal the world was not prepared to see. One French outlet dared to print it. Burkina Faso breaks chains. Behind closed doors, panic erupted. For 50 years, they had extracted without consequence. Now, one nation had flipped the script, and others might follow. Traore said nothing for 2 days. No speeches, no press conference, no comment. In that silence, embassies trembled. Corporations begged for dialogue. Aid agencies paused disbursements. Threats buzzed beneath diplomatic smiles. Still silence. Because silence, sometimes, is not absence. It is power. And in that vacuum, a new kind of fear emerged. African unpredictability. For too long, the continent had been predictable, compliant, apologetic, divided. But now, even silence screamed. And behind closed doors, every corrupt official in the region asked the same question. What if we are next? Inside a high-security vault in Ouagadougou, walls were covered in classified evidence. Contracts, memos, shipment logs, satellite overlays. Photos showed poisoned rivers, abandoned clinics, malnourished miners. One dossier revealed secret funding for private militias, labeled as logistics support. Each document detailed not just theft but design. They had built systems to erase accountability. They turned legal loopholes into policy. For decades, this archive was impossible. Now it was undeniable. And Traore's decision was clear. He would not bury it. He would show it to the world, because the greatest weapon against empire is exposure. They had promised development, clean water, roads, schools, employment. But near the mines, the truth was different. Children drank from poisoned streams. Roads led only to export hubs. Clinics were unstaffed. Wages were delayed or stolen. They built schools, then left them without books. They built homes, then denied locals the land. One contract stated, company is not responsible for resettlement. Another, royalties waived for 10 years. Burkina Faso had not signed contracts, it had signed chains. And when Traore read them line by line, he did not rage. He prepared, because promises are not kept by goodwill. They are kept by force of will. One Belgian executive laughed during his arrest. You think you can hold me? My country will bury you in sanctions, he said, smirking. 3 hours later, in an interrogation room, lined with screen, he stared silently at his own email, authorizing a bribe labeled environmental adjustment fee, then another, then a third, an encrypted message detailing how to bypass Burkina Faso's export monitoring. The laughter faded. He was not a master strategist anymore. He was a man unraveling. For years, he had treated Africa like a broken ATM, no PIN code needed, no alarm triggered. But now, the machine fought back, and for the first time in his career, his signature was not a symbol of control. It was evidence. Advisors warned him. They said it would spark retaliation, that France might freeze aid, the IMF might withdraw, ECOWAS might condemn him. But Traore did not flinch. If we keep calculating risks, we will always remain colonized, he said. He knew this was not just about resources. It was about reclaiming the psychology of resistance. And so, with the world watching, he lit a fuse. Because power does not negotiate with the fearful. It only respects those who move first. And Traore moved. He understood. Even if Burkina Faso lost some trade, even if sanctions arrived, this act would rewrite dignity, not just for his nation, but for an entire continent waiting for someone to blink first. This was not reckless. It was calculated courage. Within days, a special court was announced. 5 judges, 2 from Burkina Faso, 1 from Ghana, 1 from South Africa, 1 international observer from Malaysia. It would be televised, open access, all testimony archived, every file digital and public. This was not a witch hunt. It was Christendom. Traore wanted the world to see Africa was not afraid of justice. It was afraid of its absence. And the first hearing date was set. Foreign lawyers protested. Western commentators labeled it a show trial. But they had misunderstood the show. It was not to display vengeance. It was to display memory. Because Africa had too long been told to forget. Now, it would record. Traore did not keep the files hidden. Redacted versions were emailed to investigative outlets in South Africa, Kenya, Senegal, and even Germany. Within 48 hours, headlines erupted. Corporate pillage unmasked. The contracts that stole Africa. Traore's files shake the global south. It became a firestorm, not just about mining, about corruption, bribery, neo-imperialism. And suddenly, Traore was not alone. He was a symbol. One journalist from Nairobi tweeted, "Whether you agree or not, Traore made truth louder than silence." And across the continent, phones buzzed with one phrase. He actually did it. Ambassadors arrived at the palace with prepared statements. They spoke of investment confidence, treaty obligations, regional stability. Traore let them speak, then handed them sealed envelopes. Inside, photos of their diplomatic vehicles parked outside illegal mining operations, copies of signed waivers bypassing environmental law, transcripts of private calls acknowledging knowledge and silence. They paused. "You came to defend business," he said, "but what you built was theft." The room froze. One ambassador adjusted his tie, another asked for a glass of water, and Traore, stone-faced, said, "This is not the Africa of apology. This is the Africa of accounting." For decades, African leaders feared The Hague. Now, Traore flipped the narrative. He filed a formal complaint to the ICC, not as a defendant, but on behalf of Burkina Faso. The charges: illicit extraction, environmental destruction, economic sabotage, committed by multinational firm. It was bold, it was symbolic, but it was also legal. Western analysts called it a stunt. African youth called it history. Traore stood before cameras and said, "If justice belongs only to the powerful, it is not justice." And even if the case went nowhere, it served its purpose. He was planting a seed, one that might outlive him. The mining firms fought back. They unleashed media campaigns, published op-eds, paid influencers, sponsored economists. Burkina Faso is unstable. Investors beware. Nationalization leads to collapse. But something had shifted. People no longer believed voices with logos. They believed what they saw: arrests, evidence, action. Traore did not respond. He did not need to, because every billboard they bought reminded Africa that someone was afraid, and fear, in the hearts of the exploiters, was a new and beautiful thing. Near the Tambayo mine sat a forgotten village, dust-covered, water poisoned, trees dead, children sick. Traore visited without cameras. He walked barefoot, drank from a local cup, listened. An old woman told him when they came, they promised light, but they brought shadow. He said nothing but returned days later with engineers, medics, and reparations. The mine was shut, the river was treated, and the school, long used as a storage unit by the company, was reopened with local teachers. One student stood and whispered, "President, we remember." He nodded. "So do I." Gold was only the surface. Buried beneath the northeastern sands lay oil discovered years ago, but never disclosed. Foreign firms had used research visas to begin exploration. Contracts were buried in shell companies. Test drills masked as agricultural studies. The operation had already begun. Had Traore not acted, when he did, the fields would be gone. What he uncovered was terrifying. Over 200 million barrels mapped, with 80% allocated to firms registered in tax havens, signed by former ministers. Traore stood before his cabinet and said, they were not just stealing gold, they were stealing tomorrow. And in that room, even silence bowed. Something stirred far beyond Burkina Faso. In student halls across Dakar, Lagos, and Nairobi, debates exploded. In marketplaces, Traore's name became a whisper of possibility. In parliaments, opposition leaders quoted him to thunderous applause. This was not a cult, it was a current. For too long, Africa had been told what it could not do. Now it had seen what one man with resolve and no permission could make possible. A new phrase took root. If Traore could do it, why not us? The world watched. The trials were public. The evidence was streamed. The judges wore no wigs, only the weight of history. Victims came forward, former workers, mothers, farmers, environmental scientists, all telling the same story, how wealth was taken and life left behind. One executive broke down, another denied everything until confronted with his own voice on tape. This was not courtroom drama, it was the unwriting of a myth, that Africa could not prosecute the powerful. But now the continent had a new doctrine. Immunity ends where harm begins, and every verdict echoed further than its sentence. June 7th. The courtroom was full, cameras on, families watching from village halls. The verdict: guilty, 17 years in prison, 20 million in restitution, corporate assets seized. The man collapsed in his chair, once a titan, now an inmate. But no one cheered, because this was not vengeance, it was correction. And in the silence that followed, Traore stood outside and simply said, "One down, more to come." It was not a threat, it was a promise. The shockwaves traveled. Guinea suspended all mining contracts for review. Mali announced a sovereign resource audit. Ghana passed a transparency law. A new kind of competition had begun, not for foreign deal, but for dignity. Citizens no longer demanded jobs. They demanded justice. And in boardrooms from Johannesburg to Nairobi, executives asked, what if our turn is next? Traore had not started a rebellion. He had triggered an alignment. Africa, often described as fragmented, was rediscovering its spine. Shares plummeted. A British mining firm delisted from the Frankfurt Exchange. A Canadian company filed for emergency restructuring. French conglomerates faced shareholder lawsuits. What frightened them most? Not the arrests, the evidence. Years of theft, recorded, named, tracked. They had always gambled that Africa lacked archive. But now, the past had receipts. One analyst said, this is not just a scandal, it's an earthquake. And at the epicenter stood a soldier who refused to sell silence. With seized funds, Traore created a sovereign development fund, transparent, community audited, publicly tracked online. Within 90 days, 3 new rural hospitals opened, school lunch programs expanded, women-led farming collectives funded, roads, once pitted with holes, were paved with local labor. It was not a miracle, it was mathematics. What had been stolen once returned could finally serve, and across villages, one message reappeared: justice is the best investment. The retaliation began not with bombs, but with buzzwords. Western powers issued joint statements concerning trends, risk to investment climate, authoritarian overreach. Aid was paused. Trade talks delayed. Rumors of sanctions swirled, but Traore did not blink. "We have been sanctioned for being silent," he said. "We will survive being honest." The world expected begging. What it got was backbone. And as one minister whispered, "They fear us now not because of weapons, but because we remembered who we are." Africa had been punished for rebellion before. This time, it would be punished for standing. But standing, it would remain. They were not polished diplomats, not legacy politicians. Traore's advisors were teachers, activists, data analysts, most under 40, most uninvited to elite summits, but they were fearless. One had exposed procurement fraud as a student. Another hacked open a fake land registry. A third had organized water strikes in the Sahel. They had scars, not resumes, and together they formed a firewall against compromise. Their motto was simple: no return to silence. Because they knew even more dangerous than foreign powers was the temptation to forget, and in the war for memory, they chose militancy. At the University of Ouagadougou, a new course appeared: empire, extraction, and African resistance. Classrooms overflowed. Professors revised syllabi. A former mining intern turned whistleblower taught the lecture on contract manipulation in one session. A student asked, "What do we do now?" The professor answered, "We study, we remember, then we act." From Senegal to Uganda, universities followed suit. Curriculums changed, not to teach bitterness, but to arm the mind. Because sovereignty, Traoré believed, was not just a battlefield, it was a blackboard. The mainstream headlines hesitated, but African journalists did not. They launched podcasts, investigative series, special reports in 5 languages. A Pan-African media alliance formed, funded by public donations, not foreign grants. They called it Echoes of the Soil. And they told stories not just of corruption, but of courage. The world tried to spin, but this time, Africa had microphones. As one reporter said, "We've stopped quoting the colonizer, now we quote the witness." Weeks later, it happened again, but this time, not in Burkina Faso. In Mali, Guinea, and Chad, local governments launched copycat operations, mining executives arrested, licenses revoked, legal teams summoned. Traoré's blueprint had become a virus, spreading truth, activating laws long ignored. In Ghana, one official said, "We owe our people an audit, not because Traoré did it, but because they're watching now." Justice had become regional, and the old playbook delay, divide, deny was failing. Because when one domino falls, it does not fall alone. In the dusty heartlands of the Sahel, griots began to sing, not hymns of empire, but ballads of resistance. They told of a soldier who defied giants, a flag that refused to fold, a morning when Africa stood up in markets and mosques. Elders whispered his name. He did not sell us, they said. He shamed them. Even in nations where leaders feared the precedent, the people felt the pulse. In secret, they lit candles, hung portraits, shared the files Traoré made public. Because hope once seeded in soil spreads. And now, the desert sang. Weeks after his arrest, one former executive wrote a letter. It was not addressed to lawyers. It was written to his daughter. It began, "I thought I was the civilized one, but I was the thief." He described the first time he authorized an illegal transport, the first bribe, the first village he ignored. "I told myself I was creating job, but I was extracting souls." He confessed to everything. The letter leaked, and when read on national television, even Traoré looked away, because sometimes even the truth wounds. It came in the dead of night. A convoy of rogue soldiers, unmarked vehicles, paid mercenaries. A coup attempt, but by dawn, it failed, not because of elite forces, but because thousands of civilians blocked the roads. With bodies, with songs, with resolve, women sat in the streets. Elders held hands in prayer. Youth formed human shields around government buildings. Traoré emerged, calm and unshaken. "They tried to buy back the past," he said, "but the people they remembered, the price. And when tanks are stopped by mothers, coups lose their appetite." In a village classroom, a teacher asked, "What do you want to be?" A child answered, free. Another said, unbought. A third, like Traore, these were not rehearsed responses. They were reflections. For years, African children had memorized foreign maps and foreign languages. Now they spoke of land, legacy, and law. One teacher cried quietly in the back because this was why revolutions mattered. Not to rewrite headlines, but to rewrite dreams. In boardrooms from Zurich to Dubai, panic deepened. Executives flew to Africa under false names. Crisis meetings multiplied. Emergency contracts were drafted. We'll negotiate. They begged, but it was too late. The spell had broken. Communities no longer trusted brochures. They demanded audits. And for every new PR campaign, activists released another document. The companies offered scholarships, but the people asked, what about the graves? And with every unanswered question, the ground beneath those corporations crumbled because wealth built on silence cannot survive the sound of truth. She had fled 15 years ago after exposing a fraudulent mining contract signed in her name. Now, The Economist returned, no armored escort, no red carpet, just a dusty suitcase and a passport reclaimed. At the airport, she was greeted by students holding copies of the same contract she once exposed. You were right, they said. Traore met her in the presidential courtyard, ready to finish what you started. She nodded, because revolutions do not just need soldiers. They need scribes, and truth once exiled always finds its way home. France was livid. State-owned companies were implicated, historic contracts unsealed, backdoor deals traced to embassies. Paris summoned diplomats, froze funding, labeled Traore dangerous. Burkina Faso responded by shutting down French military bases. Crowds cheered, flags waved, statues toppled. This was not anti-France. It was anti-occupation. And while officials fumed in private chambers, African youth celebrated in open squares. Because history, when finally confronted, bleeds discomfort. And for the first time in decades, France realized something unthinkable. Africa was no longer listening. It sat on a table, a single gold bar, gleaming, heavy, stamped with a European refinery mark. Next to it, two photographs, one of a malnourished child, the other a billionaire's yacht. Traore stood behind them. This, he said, pointing at the bar, was extracted illegally. This, pointing at the child, was left behind. Silence. This, he added, pointing at the yacht, was the destination. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. The image went viral. Sometimes symbols speak louder than speeches. And sometimes justice is measured in contrast. They were not on the posters, not behind podiums, but they were always there, guarding rivers, documenting damage, burying victims, feeding resistance, and now leading. Former mine cleaners now chaired land reform councils. Widows of poisoned farmers oversaw compensation fund. One woman renamed her family plot Traore, the word for rebirth. When asked why, she said, because the land remembered me. I just returned the favor. And across Burkina Faso, women reclaimed more than soil. They reclaimed narrative. It began as a whisper, then a meeting, then a leaked memo. Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, Niger. 4 nations exploring a joint economic bloc, resource control, military alliance, shared currency, not dictated by Europe, not modeled after the West, but born from urgency, forged in history. They called it the Sovereign Sahel Initiative. Western media called it radical. African youth called it ready, because unity was no longer a slogan. It was a strategy. And for the first time since decolonization, West Africa began to act like it believed in itself. They gathered in silence, not in a palace, not in a press hall, but beneath a baobab tree, roots older than empire, branches wider than maps. Traore stood before farmers, children, elders, no speechwriters, no teleprompters, only truth. He held up a single gold coin, stamped in Burkina Faso, minted from reclaimed mines. This, he said, once funded our suffering. Now it funds our healing. It began with a melody. A young musician in Ouagadougou uploaded a song titled, "We Are Not for Sale." The chorus echoed through radios, weddings, protests. They took our gold and called it trade. But we are more than what they weighed. Within weeks, it became an anthem, translated into 9 languages, played at 3 state ceremonies, sampled by DJs in Ghana and Kenya. Traore never endorsed it. He did not need to. The people had made it theirs. And when a song becomes a flag, no bullet can mute it. One of the arrested CEOs broke. In exchange for leniency, he gave names, dozens of them, officials, lawyers, bankers, presidents. He revealed how bribes were funneled through offshore art purchases and how fake NGOs masked exploitation. It was a map of betrayal, 5 continents wide. Some documents bore the logos of institutions that preached equality by day and sanctioned plunder by night. The revelations rocked boardrooms and parliaments alike, and for every name exposed, the world grew smaller and accountability larger. The site had been abandoned for years, but when they cleared the brush, they found it a shallow grave, a faded sandal, a plastic bracelet, a bone, nearby, a makeshift sign, Ali, age 11. He had died in a landslide, unrecorded, unpaid, unmourned. Traore stood at the site, planted wildflowers, closed his eyes. Then he shut the mine permanently. No gold is worth this, he said, and across the nation, new memorials were raised, not to kings, not to CEOs, but to those whose blood built balance sheets. In August, a new map was released. It wasn't geographical, it was moral. Shaded areas showed regions under sovereign control. Transparent overlays showed exploitative contracts revoked. For the first time, Africa measured itself not by GDP, but by reclaimed dignity. Scholars called it the cartography of courage. And as more countries joined the movement, the color changed, from red for risk to green for reclamation. This was not just a political shift. It was a psychological border redraw, and the continent began to see itself not as fragmented land, but as a collective will. On the 1-year anniversary, Traore did not give a speech. He returned to a village near Tambao, where the first extraction license had been signed decades ago. He sat with elders, ate with miners, watched children run across land once caged. A reporter asked, "Do you regret the risks?" He answered, "I regret we waited so long." That night, under stars, they lit lanterns, not for ceremony but for memory. Because before the revolution ends, it must be remembered, and before it is passed on, it must be felt. The crowd did not cheer. They listened, because this moment was not performance, it was promise. "Let them call us rebels," he continued, "but we are rebuilding the world we deserved all along." As the wind rose, lanterns flickered in the dusk. A little girl approached him. "Will they come back?" she asked. He knelt. "Only if we forget." Then he turned to the crowd. "If this story moved you, let the world